There's been a trend going around on Instagram and TikTok where we're all pretending that 2026 is 2016. But I know it's not 2016, and one of the big differences is back in 2016, I was a little twittery tweeter. I don't even have an account on X anymore, and at least a whole decade has gone by. So I forgive you if you don't remember the good old days. Let's fast forward to 2026. x.ai has two interconnected products, X and Grok, both of which are really testing our knowledge of the UK's online safety bill and how it's going to be implemented. Part of me wonders if Elon Musk is just trying to make us all realise how important regulation in tech is. That's how blatant the issues are with these products. Now, I'd say if that's what he's trying to do, then maybe he's succeeding. And Ashley Sinclair, the mother of one of his children, is certainly making sure that we all know what an evil MF this guy is. All of this got me thinking back to the earlier days of Twitter, and I thought it'd be a perfect time for us to look at the history of Twitter and see if there's anything that we as entrepreneurs can learn from the journey. And even more fittingly, this video is all about the remembrance of Twitter, and it's even more fitting this month because they just suspended the @Twitter handle on X. So please come with me in remembrance of Twitter and tell me in the comments what your good or bad times were with the platform. I'm Dr. Becky Sage, and this is my series, Is It Marmite?, where we do a deep dive into businesses that people either love or hate. I look back at the stories and see if there is anything that we can learn, either about business or about ourselves. So, back to X. It is absolutely disgusting that between December and January of 25-26, up to 50% of the images produced were of either naked or nearly naked women that were non-consensual. What's even more disgusting is that 2% of all images were of children. In fact, it's more than disgusting. It's damaging and it's illegal. Now, of course, Elon Musk makes a joke of it initially, and then decides that anything that inhibits any action, however damaging it is to others, constitutes blocking freedom of speech. No, you have freedom of speech, but if you do illegal things, you should face the consequences of those illegal things. And if you, as the person running the platform, does not do anything about it, then you should suffer consequences. And yet, before all of this came to light, it's been a while since I've been on that platform. Like so many of you, I came off the platform when Elon Musk took over and shut down my account. And I know that when I did that, that was my liberal, lefty, whatever, woke mind having a knee-jerk reaction to, I do not want this guy in charge of this thing. I do not trust him. But do I regret doing it at that point? I don't think I was wrong not to trust him. I have at times thought I wish I was on there so I could continue to be part of conversations. We don't create progress. We don't create positive change if all we do is just have a knee-jerk reaction to people who are different to us. At the same time, I probably wasn't going to get much more value from being part of the conversations on X once he took over. I'm also at the point right now when I'm really frustrated about how we compartmentalize different things as being on the left or the right of politics, and we put everyone in those boxes. So I know for me specifically, I think back then, all I really knew about Elon Musk was, I mean, obviously I knew about some of his tech stuff, but the things that had put me off were the things that he'd said about trans rights, and just the way he talked about people who are different from him, thinking a different way. He would talk about wokeness and stuff like that. So those were the things that put me off and went, yeah, he's not like me, so I'm not going to engage on that platform. And those things do misalign with my politics, but at the same time, I'm like, I should have probably used my own brain rather than just being like, oh, I sit on this side, so I'm just going to leave because this guy's walked in. But am I glad I don't exist there anymore? Absolutely, yes. But there was a time that Twitter was a place for connection, for an amplification of ideas, a place where you could use your own voice and connect with other people who perhaps you would never have been able to connect to in the past. Now I know I probably had rose-tinted glasses on, but those were the halcyon days of social media as far as I was concerned. And those days really helped me not only build my whole career, but also overcome lots of my own personal challenges. And I'll talk about more of them in the future. I would love to know what your views are on social media. Are you still on it? I mean, you're watching me on YouTube, so is this social media? What are the goods? What are the bads? Can we find those nuances and try and amplify the good parts while minimizing the bad? God, I hate X. But is it Marmite? There's some people who love it. But more importantly, are there things that we can learn from the story of Twitter? So let's go back to the beginning. The origin story. It's been 20 years and I can still remember being able to log in without having to dial up. And how easy and joyful that felt. I still lived in a home where we only had one computer, and I was in the middle of doing my PhD, but I didn't have a laptop the entire time. Let's be real, we were still mostly analog, baby. So while I was juggling a PhD, gymnastics coaching, part-time jobs and dreams of being a performer, and other people were non-consensually posting pictures of me on Facebook, and I hate to say it, but I did the same. It was the Wild West, you think? It's still the Wild West now. And there was a group of people working on what is now a long dead podcasting platform called Odeo. And within their work, they used to do hackathons. Now, this was pre-iPhone, but not a really long time pre-iPhone. And so they would come up with all of these different ideas, these different projects, and they were mostly in the social media space because that was the background of the team. So 4 people came together to come up with this idea. We had Jack Dorsey, at Jack, you may know him as. He was the guy that came up with the original idea. He really understood kind of that idea around using social media to create community, to democratize media. And many people say that Jack is very weird. That's what we hear a lot. Many of the things that I hear about him actually make me think, as a neurodivergent person, that sounds like me. Now, I'm not going to diagnose anybody else, obviously, but maybe just bear that in mind. The next person we had was Evan Williams. He was actually the first 100% shareholder of Twitter, because he was the owner of Odeo. He also had started and sold the blogging platform called Blogger. So essentially he was the one at Odeo that was bringing these people together and then creating spaces for things like the hackathons. Then we had Biz Stone. So he was somebody who, he was the first creative director at Twitter. And he really does seem to be the person who gelled the team together. And then the final person you will see listed as a founder of Twitter, even though actually he had very little involvement after the beginning and really didn't get to be part of the journey very much, is Noah Glass. So he would bring in a lot of energy and actually even came up with the name. And then it was a bit like, bye-bye. I've heard him described by Biz Stone as one of their friends. Make sure you keep him off the cap table. But he really hasn't been that involved with the journey of Twitter for a long time. But once the idea had been generated, he sat at a computer for weeks and weeks and weeks and went through the alphabet trying to come up with names. When he got to T, the word Twitter came up. And because the meaning of the word Twitter is the short bits of communication between birds, it made a lot of sense in this context. Some of the other names that had been thrown about were Ketchup, because you get to catch up with your friends, and Friend Stalker, which, given some of the things that happened, could have been a more apt name for Twitter going forward. But Twitter was what they landed on. And initially, because it was all the rage back then, they liked to remove consonants, so it was Twitter with an no-e, just an R on the end. Ultimately, that changed. So as I said, Noah Glass wasn't really a part of this story for a long period of time. He went on to form Olo, which is a restaurant app, and then the Founders Collective. So there are a few conflicting stories about the details of how Twitter was founded, but there is some general consensus. I'm sure Noah Glass has some excellent tea to spill, but the idea essentially came from the idea of the status update. So can we send SMS to do a status update to a group of friends or a group of curated people? SMS was the technology that was around then, and that's also the reason for the character limit. Now, please tell me if you still remember this whole idea of the status update. I know if you're my age, you definitely do. So when Facebook was first set up, we weren't just allowed to be like, post whatever you want. Well, we were allowed to post whatever we want, but it wasn't just kind of, I guess they didn't trust that we really knew what we were doing, which again, we obviously don't know what we're doing, and we still don't know what we're doing on social media, but the beginning of Facebook, every Facebook post would say, Becky's Sage is, I've done it the wrong way because I'm doing it, Becky's Sage is ... And then you had to fill out the next bit. So it's like, so much of it was stuff you were doing right now. Or how you're feeling right now. Becky Sage is feeling disappointed. Becky Sage is excited because I'm going to London today. Becky Sage is listening to Alanis Morissette, Jagged Little Pill. Yeah, that's how it all started. And so this idea of the status update was something that had come from Facebook, and then they're like, well, what if all the platform was a status update, basically? And according to Biz Stone, the real question then was like, is that enough of a thing? Because let's be real, like the idea of having a platform that's just about status updates seems a little like, why do we need that? And so Evan Williams then stepped in and said, like, what is novel? What is happening right now that makes this relevant? And that was the answer. It was like being able to check in with people in real time. And it's so funny that this was really the value proposition, was like being able to know what my friends are doing right now. For a lot of people, and it was about, oh, are my friends out and about? You know, like, can I go and meet with them? Where are they? If you're at an event, can you go and meet up with people? So it's quite interesting because that's definitely valuable, but at the same time, is also quite concerning. And I guess for most of us, we don't really do an awful lot of social media in real time if we're looking after our own safety. So in 2 weeks, in March 2026? No, not 2016, 2006. The very first tweet, which is a picture of a bison apparently, was sent out. By January 2007, so this is 9 months later, there were 21,000 users of Twitter. So for a lot of you listening, especially if you're in the really early days, you're probably thinking like, how do we go from, if I want to have users on a platform, how do I go from 0, 1, my small group of friends, to 21,000? There's not an awful lot that documents this about Twitter. And of course, 21,000 is nowhere near enough to be able to make money, to be able to really create the kind of network effects that you need, to be able to necessarily attract investment. But it's a strong foundation to grow those things from. So if you are at the beginning, you know, you don't really want to be looking too far beyond that. You need to be getting those first people in initially. And for them, it wasn't linear. It wasn't quick, although 9 months does seem kind of quick, but that's only in hindsight, right? The initial strategy was friends and family. Like, how do they just go around their own network and grow via the network that they already had? Because this team was in Silicon Valley, they were surrounded by people who were tech enthusiasts, who were interested in new platforms, new things that were going on. So that was helpful for them as well. They weren't starting from scratch in terms of business too, especially Evan Williams, who had built Blogger, which essentially was, you know, very similar to Twitter in many ways. Blogger was a platform for longer form blogs. Twitter is a platform for microblogging. So they already had some of that knowledge and that understanding of how you just get out there and you've got to just engage with many, many people to try and grow that platform. They did a grand launch in September 2006 at something called the Love Parade, which was a rave in San Francisco. And apparently they got 100 signups then, but 100 signups does not make 21,000. However, each event, each conversation, each new person signed up is an opportunity to then grow again. And you've got to remember the context by which they were building at that time, which is that there wasn't so many different things to be distracted by. Something like Twitter would have been, you know, novel and new and exciting and a way to connect to your friends. So each person could then be amplified because they would have brought a few more people on board as well, in a way that it's much, much harder to do these days. You know, think back to me. Without us, I had a little flip phone back then. I think I had a little pink Samsung flip phone, but I didn't have that laptop. I didn't have that computer. I wasn't completely exposed to screen time. What's wild is even as I'm talking to you right now, I can see 4 screens in front of me in this room, whereas before I basically had kind of a shared screen and a phone that wasn't really working with the internet. So we weren't fatigued and burnt out by all of this screen time, is what I'm trying to say. The other interesting thing here was that the 140 characters gave creative constraints. And actually what you're doing by doing that is making it easier for people to just throw stuff out there. Nobody's expecting like a long, amazing crafted essay or even a blog. It's just a sentence. And I know like so many people spent years complaining that they wanted more than 140 characters on Twitter, but that constraint would have made it easier when things first started. So what can we learn from the origin story? I think first and foremost, simplicity of ideas is important. Twitter was an incredibly simple idea, and yeah, it did cut through into the time that we were living in back then. The fact that the technology, or at least the initial technology, essentially the prototype, could be built incredibly quickly, but not only that, people could use it incredibly easily. And that meant that all the focus could be on how do we grow the user numbers. So the actual lesson here is like, the simplicity also really helps with that prioritization. So what can you do to make your business as simple as possible, at least for right now? Now, I'm going to say some things that maybe slightly contradict that a little bit later, but I do think it's something to really bear in mind. What is that one thing you need to focus on? And in this case, it was driving up user numbers and engagement from those users. I also think that, again, this is the type, when I think of entrepreneurship, I think of the type of things that this founding team described. So they talk about just being on whiteboards, being in the office together, Googling names for weeks and weeks and weeks. I feel like so much creativity has been lost these days. And you might argue, like, did it need to be creative in order to come up with, let's type one sentence or 140 characters and share it with our friends? Well, maybe that bit wasn't the creative bit, so to speak. But they had to be creative, they had to think differently in order to then get out there and grow the platform and to be able to see the scope of the idea. Now, the other thing with Twitter is, and I've kind of brushed over it slightly as I began to tell this story, but this was essentially an intrapreneurial endeavor, not an entrepreneurial one. So these people were all going to work, and they were getting to work on this when they were in their workplace. Now, I know that each of them had kind of entrepreneurial tendencies in different ways, but you might argue that it really was only Evan Williams that had gone through that truly entrepreneurial process. And so at the beginning of Twitter, this wasn't born from like a bunch of people having to hustle around their day job. They could actually focus on the growth, at least in those early days, or focus on just getting that platform built out and generating those ideas while they were in their day job. So anyone who's ever kind of looked at the Twitter journey and thought, oh, why can't I do that? Or anyone's comparing themselves to that journey, your scenario is completely different. And then the other lesson I think that we can learn, in addition to keeping it simple, is not to quit when you're in the valley. This was something I heard in a video that somebody else said talking about social media, and I was thinking, this is the same for entrepreneurs. And one of the things we need to do is keep on slogging even when we can't really see the light at the end of the tunnel. That idea of it's always darkest before the dawn, or what you do in the dark puts you in the light, or quitting right before you see the success. And of course, you've got to be realistic in your life in terms of how much time, effort, energy, reputation you can put into any endeavor. But if this is something that really matters to you, if you've got faith and belief in it, then you've got to keep on slogging away. That 100 people who have signed up to something How are you going to turn them into 200? How is that 200 going to grow into 1,000, 1,000 into 5,000, and so on and so on? And how do you make sure that you keep on learning as you're doing that? Now, even though, 21,000 was not going to be enough to grow this business, it was enough to get them a strong foundation, to learn more about the platform, and to really figure out how they were going to grow it going forward. Now, I just made a video about hustle culture, and I kept thinking about like this idea of, is this the hustle? And I was thinking, well, the reality is, I know nothing about the mental health of any of these founders at this particular time or anything like that. But compared to what some founders are going through, there was probably a bit of stability. And so it wasn't such a hustle mindset necessarily, even though it was a case of, right, we need to get these numbers up. To me, when I think about that in that way, that's just healthy milestones that are going to help you get to where you want to go. How to make that not a kind of super hustle-y thing is to focus, to have that clear priority. And I do think that this is what I see quite a lot, is people not really knowing which thing to prioritize. And that's usually because they're not looking at the longer term view and then working back, or they're not stepping back and getting perspective. So normally in these videos, I kind of go through what the pitch might have been in those really early days. Twitter didn't need that. It was being supported by Odeo and Evan Williams initially, very early on. And in fact, this is quite an interesting story because Odeo itself had a bunch of investors. And at some point in time, Evan Williams decided that he would do a buyback of their shares. Because you see, Twitter had been developed within those walls. It was a product of Odeo at that point in time. But of course, they were also seeing that with other things that were going on, this podcasting platform that they'd created was not going to survive much longer. So they bought back the shares, which is what made Evan Williams a 100% shareholder in Twitter at the beginning. And in order to do that, he really had to convince them that there was no worth in the company at that time. So it's kind of hilarious. It's like doing the opposite of what most early stage founders are doing. Most people are going, no, there's value here. You've just got to see that longer term vision. And he was like, look, there's no value here. Maybe we're playing with this thing over here, but there's nothing in it. We haven't got any users yet. We haven't, not even worth mentioning probably. So it's so interesting. It's kind of like a reverse pitch. Now, just thinking about whether or not that would have got seed funding in those early days, and they didn't get external funding until 2007, and I'll tell you what they'd done to get to that point in a minute. I was just speaking to an investor about this yesterday, and we were just laughing about this idea of like, there is absolutely no way this could have got funding. If it had, it would have been off the strength of the background of the founding team, and specifically Evan Williams, because of the track record he'd already had. Blogger had been acquired by Google in 2003, and the amount is undisclosed, but it was somewhere between 25 and 50 million. So that would have been enough of a track record probably, and he would have had those connections around him if he'd have needed to put some money in. Obviously, having gone through the process of doing that acquisition, he likely had money that he could put in to support the business in the early days. You can see that that is a good precedent that, okay, I took this blogging platform and I was able to do an acquisition for 25 to 50 million. And now here's a microblogging platform that I'm going to grow, and then we can do an acquisition and you get your money back. That would have been probably a useful conversation to have with the investor friends if they'd have needed money at that point in time. So what are the lessons we can learn here? I mean, the thing with Twitter is there was no obvious need. And there wasn't an awful lot of thought about how it would drive revenue, at least amongst most of the team. And this is really clear when you look back at interviews that different members of the team made, way past the beginning of Twitter, like even right up to IPO and beyond, that revenue was not the thing they were really thinking about. Now, was there a desire? Was this something that understood the zeitgeist at the time? Yes, and perhaps that's something that we really need to learn as founders, like, what is it? And we talk a lot about like, why now? And I think that why now question is an incredibly powerful one for you to answer if you're thinking about growing a business. But the reality is, and I hate to say it, if you don't have a monetization strategy, even if it's one that's going to change, but at least some kind of strategy there with some kind of evidence that it might work. And if you don't have evidence that there's at least intent to buy or generate that revenue from the people you'd be generating the revenue from, then you're very, very unlikely to be able to raise investment. A small number of people will be able to, but particularly those UK founders that I'm talking to right now, you need traction. You need, in many cases, revenue as well. And then there's something else in terms of lessons learned here, which is about that ownership piece. And I think there is something quite insightful, and I think Evan Williams probably noticed, okay, there is something else over here that we're going to grow and build. There is potential in this Twitter thing, and probably there's less potential in audio, so how are we going to make that work? And this idea of ownership seems to come up a lot in the Twitter story, and kind of how valuable that ownership is, and why is that ownership valuable? Is it about money or is it about control? And there was a BBC documentary about Twitter in which Biz Stone said that he kind of started to realise that power and money both played a big part. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. There is a very, very clear pivotal moment for Twitter, and that was South by Southwest in 2007. In fact, we mentioned this in the Airbnb deep dive as well, because they essentially saw what Twitter did and went, ha, that's powerful, let's do the same. So what Twitter did is, during South by Southwest in 2007, they essentially took some big screens. They put Twitter on there, and then they were tweeting, and you could see the tweets coming up on those screens. Now, many of you may remember this. I haven't seen it for quite a while now at an event, but this has been such a big thing at events, is that to be able to see the tweets allows you to open up the conversation to more people that are in the room. Also allows you to kind of do things like make announcements about what other events are coming up, or, oh, should we go and meet up and chat about this further? It's a really powerful use case for Twitter. And of course, South by Southwest was a really great audience. It wasn't such a tech festival then, or even a kind of general festival then, as it is now. You know, it was movies and music. But they were able to use this event to truly propel the business. During South by Southwest, their usage tripled, with the daily tweet volume going from around about 20,000 to 60,000. And their growth from February to March, in terms of the total number of tweets, had been 55%, whereas as soon as they'd gone to South by Southwest, so the growth from March to April, was 190%. And by the time the conference was over, they had 50,000 weekly active users. But of course, this is a business with network effects. So by having that concentration of people all using Twitter at that particular time, and the growth starting to go up, that would have then proliferated even wider after the event. And of course it's high profile, so it's not just those users going up. There are people who could be influential who are also getting to know Twitter through that event. So I think this is more of, in terms of lessons, this is more than just saying, oh, you gotta make a big splash, have a launch event, do a hard launch, whatever it might be. The beauty of what Twitter did here is that Twitter and events go together like cheese on toast. They're incredibly complementary. And they might even make people feel really, really good. It wasn't just about marketing. It wasn't just about brand and product awareness. This was showing the product in action and allowing users to experience the benefits in real time. Too many people have events where they just go and kind of demo what they do, or they talk about it, or you can go to a stand and see a video or something. And not all products lend themselves to the type of thing that Twitter was able to do at South by Southwest. But I really do think that you need to be thinking about, how do we actually get our users to go on that journey with the product. Now, ideally en masse, like Twitter did with South by Southwest, but even if it's smaller scale, you are better off having a smaller group of people actually feeling the benefits of what you do than having a large number of people just being like, oh yeah, that was nice, that sounded good. They don't experience anything, so they move on. How do you really facilitate the use of your product? So we can't go through one of these videos without talking about investment. How did they get the money to grow? Because they certainly weren't doing it through revenue in those early days. Maybe not ever. In fact, Twitter are the figurehead for growing without great monetization. I mean, they weren't profitable at IPO. So in total, before going public, Twitter raised £685 million. As you know, because the data I get is in pounds, I like to just tell you it in pounds. I will tell you if I'm talking in dollars or pounds. They got some money in after South by Southwest. Actually, documented as their first round is a £50,000 round, and then not long after that they did a £2.5 million raise. They went from a £600,000 pre-money valuation to a £11 million pre-money valuation over that 6-month period of time. And that's because after South by Southwest, they were able to start growing to about 400,000 tweets per quarter. They did several other rounds. Like I said, they kept on going and going to that total I told you just now. By December 2010, they did a 126 million round with a pre-money valuation of 2.1 billion. This was the first valuation that put them into unicorn status. And at that time, the user growth had grown significantly. By 2012, they had 200 million active users. And that 2010 round I was just talking about, that was apparently their Series F round, and they were not generating any revenue. So again, when I talk to investors, I'm like, God, we wouldn't even do a Series A without any revenue generation, let alone a Series F. Now, a lot more happened in this time, and I will go back to a little bit of it in a minute. The team, there was a lot of flux, but also, of course, there was growth, and that was what was being responded to in terms of this increased valuation. Because the thing is, following 2007, going 2007, 2008, lots of people really started to love Twitter. I believe I first got on it around about 2008 because I remember using it in my early work. I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Celebrities started to join, and many people just really loved that intimate connection that you could, maybe we'd call it a parasocial connection now, but what felt like a more intimate connection that you could get with other people who you didn't know in real life on Twitter. Celebrities really loved this. I think maybe they liked being able to connect without having to curate their voices so much. And also it's just so much quicker and easier, right? You just type something on a platform versus having to go and get all your hair and makeup done and go and sit and get booked into some kind of TV slot. The Twitter team went on to Oprah, and on that day they generated 400,000 new users. Evan Williams talks about the fact that Oprah did a tweet live on air, and apparently she refreshed the screen and the tweet disappeared just as they were cutting to commercial break, luckily. And so he had to quickly take it and repost it so that tweet went out in real time. At that point, Ashton Kutcher was somebody else who was seen to be a very avid Twitter fan, and we know that he's been quite related with the tech sector. He wrote about Evan Williams and Biz Stone in Time magazine. He was very tightly linked to it, not just because he was into tech, but also because he was the first person to reach 1 million followers on Twitter. And what he said was, for someone like me who lives in a construct of filtered communication packaged and polished by the industry that employs me, Twitter has become a new instrument for expressing myself and accessing cultural trends, opinions, and information. Twitter is my front door to the internet and my medium for sharing the content I create while advocating for the causes close to my heart and investing in the connections I want to have with people from all walks of life. I believe that Twitter is a stage for humanity and connection, not the triumph of technology. Right now, the word revolution is spelled with 140 characters. Now, there are plenty of things on the internet about why Ashton Kutcher might not be the person that we want to be inspired by, but I do think that these words of humanity, of connection, are really important ones. That democratization of media does have a profound impact on society, and I think that there was a very hopeful, perhaps naive time when we felt like if everyone had a voice, then they would use that voice to show their humanity and to show their connection, and that humanity would be something good and amplifying. Unfortunately, that doesn't feel like the world that has revealed itself through the past 2 decades of social media. So of course, over time, Twitter began to generate revenue, mostly from advertising and some from data licensing. And on November the 15th, 2013, Twitter raised $1.8 billion in an IPO. At this point, the combined wealth of Williams, Dorsey, and Costolo, who I haven't talked to you about yet, but I will do in a minute, hit roughly $4 billion. And what was so interesting at that time is that this was when there was a lot of talk about whether or not there was a tech bubble. So, you know, very analogous to this particular time as well. The company was valued at $13 billion, and there was a lot of excitement around the IPO. But Twitter was unprofitable then, in 2013, and it was still unprofitable 2 years later, in 2015. At that time, they had about 250 million users, and apparently there was eventually some profit in 2017. And the peak number of users was around about 259 million daily active users in 2022. What can we learn from Twitter's growth? There is so much more to say in this story. I think, as I said before, the Twitter growth was really about a zeitgeist and network effects. You've got to go out there and create excitement about the product. You've got to have people using it. I think this is similar lessons to before. One thing that they were able to do was really demonstrate the value of the assets, and the asset being that communication to so many people. So, as we said before, power and money are going hand in hand the whole time with this company. Because Twitter would never pass a test that says, oh, you have to have 1 million ARR before you can get your Series A, then you have to get to this point before you get your Series B. It just did not work like that for them. However, it just does work like that for many other people. One of the important things, I guess, to say is if you are going to be selling advertising and or data, then numbers and quality of data really is going to matter, especially right now. So for advertising, we know this isn't rocket science. You have to have high numbers, and that's what they were focused on, right? Is how do we get as many people as possible on this platform, because that is what they're selling. If you don't pay for it, then you're the product. So I think really understanding the actual extent to which you need to grow in terms of creating valuable data, if this is the strategy that you're going to be utilizing. So I wanted to move on to just thinking back about why I loved Twitter. And don't worry, we're going to come to the controversies soon, and we know there are quite a few to talk about. But also, there was something so hopeful, so positive about these platforms where anyone can have a voice. So many people had felt voiceless up to that point. And not only that, I think many people had felt the impacts of mainstream media being very narrow in its focus. And so having platforms, and not just Twitter, of course, but Twitter was the one that I was probably on the most back in the early 2010s. And one of the questions that got raised was, why did so many people want so many other people to know so much about them? And I think, or certainly in my own experience, it's because I was like, oh, this is finally a chance to make a change, to connect with like-minded people, to share the ideas and the experiences that I have. It was also a way to get an alternative source of news, to get wider perspectives. It is interesting that Twitter or X is listed as a free speech platform, because when we really think about free speech, like, those are the things that it should represent. It doesn't feel like that's what it represents anymore. For me, it was an extremely valuable thing. I did a lot of work in events at that particular point in time, and like I said before, events and Twitter go very, very well together. It was a great way to shout about what was going on, to get people along to events, but also get people talking at events. For me personally, it allowed me to build my profile and connect with people. And one thing I've always found on social media is I find it so much easier to be myself than I do in real life. Like, that's a thing, well, for me anyway, that's because I'm neurodivergent. That's because I have 40 years of masking and mirroring behind me. I find it much easier if you let me step back and do things in my own space than expect me to do things face to face in terms of connecting. So that asynchronous nature, I think, is incredibly powerful. And I do think a lot of neurodivergent people really have got a lot out of social media. I do remember using it as my newsfeed for quite a long time, although I can't remember really any specific events that I found out about on Twitter. But I can always remember being like, things would come through on Twitter and then I would Google what was going on. And I know that this seems so strange right now, but I actually got my first ever LinkedIn recommendation because of my adoption of Twitter. People, when I was early in my career, it was my first couple of jobs around post PhD, 2008, 2009, and people used to be like, oh, you're so great at utilizing the new technology and adopting it and then using it to help us to achieve our goals. And so for me, that was something which I think all young people can experience, right? This is where you might have an upper hand if you're used to using platforms. So I loved that I was able to distinguish myself because I was able to adopt these technologies. And then I also really, really loved some of the other incredible aspects of having a platform like this. There was the disaster relief, and I think that the earthquake in Japan was an example of this. After the 2011 Tohoku earthquake, Twitter was really critical for people who were trying to locate loved ones. And then I think that its ability to be used for advocacy is incredibly important. And I actually think we're experiencing something very strange right now with social media, where we do still need these places to find other advocates and to advocate for the causes that are important to us. But at the same time, a lot of the causes that we need to advocate for are things that social media is causing. So it's becoming a very confusing time with that. And I think that that's something that I'm continuing to explore in my work. And there were massive events in the world that happened because of Twitter. There was the Arab Spring, we had the Black Lives Matter movement, we had Me Too, and all of those things actually created real societal change. Maybe we're seeing some backlash from that now, but hopefully that's short-lived. And what I really liked about all of this is that, Jack Dorsey was showing up at protests. All of these things that the platform was being used for were also things that the founders stood for. And so there was this coherence, although it got very, very confusing for reasons I will come on to in a minute. So when I look back personally, I really used Twitter in a very similar way to how a lot of people use LinkedIn these days. It was definitely a work platform for me, although a bit of gymnastics on there too. And the ability for Twitter to be used as an activist's platform, I think it has to be one of the best things about it. But the trouble is, activism and extremism are not a million miles away. And that's what we're seeing now. So I think one of the things that keeps occurring to me in terms of what people can learn from this is it's not about necessarily getting sucked into the business model. I mean, you do need to know the nuts and bolts, the bread and butter of how your business is going to work. And there was some experience on the Twitter team, both Well, we've already talked about Evan Williams, but Biz Stone had also worked at Google and so had seen the early days of that. But I think that there was something about Twitter that said, we're going to create this platform and we don't know exactly where it's going to go. We are going to co-create the future with our users. There were things they got wrong as they were doing that. And we will come on to those things in a minute. But I do think there's an important lesson to be learned in terms of founders kind of observing, watching, what is it that people do? What is it that they want? What are your underpinning principles that you are not going to sway from? But also, what are the bits where you can be flexible and provide people what they are seeking, whether they know it or not? And also, maybe there is something here about just because you're not living up to traditional metrics doesn't mean that you're not a success. And how are you going to define success for yourself and for your business, for your life? Because in many people's eyes, Twitter would be seen as underperforming for a very, very long time. But they definitely always had a long-term perspective about what value creation meant. So we know there have been plenty of controversies related to Twitter and X since Elon Musk has taken over. Elon was not responsible for all the controversies. In fact, there were many pre-Elon controversies. In fact, the dark side of Twitter emerged relatively quickly, and there are quite a lot of things for us to look at here. Now, the original suggestion of a name, Friendstalker, was not far off the mark, and as early as 2007, 2008, people were already experiencing stalkers coming from Twitter, and they would message people in ways that made them know that they knew where they were, knew who they were talking to, where they were going. It made a lot of people, particularly women, feel incredibly unsafe. In fact, in one BuzzFeed article, a reputable news organization, they said Twitter has not only tolerated abuse and hate, it's virtually been optimized to accommodate it. Friendstalker, anyone? Ariel Waldman is one person whose story is relatively well known. She was a pretty early adopter of Twitter, starting it in 2007, and it really worked well for her because she was a blogger and community manager. So this fitted her work really well, and she became one of the 100 most followed accounts in the early days. But soon after, she was getting threatening tweets, a lot of abuse, with lots of disgusting words thrown her way. Of course, it's more than just words as well. This is people who are threatening. And perhaps even now people think that this can be harmless, but there are very real safety threats. And even if those safety threats aren't physical, which there are physical safety threats, the mental toll that it takes to get consistent abuse online is incredibly damaging for people. So she was actually able to reach out to Jack Dorsey himself and have phone conversations with him. They went absolutely nowhere. And being a really small company, they were scared. They were scared that if they banned somebody, then there would be a lawsuit. And then they would have to fight that, and they wouldn't be able to fight that because they were that small. Biz Stone formally acknowledged the problem and said that the platform was there to facilitate communication, but was not a mediator of content. And this was right at the beginning, sows the seeds for the problems that we have now. Because this is the thing, often I get asked by founders, or I see them grappling with, well, we're only small, we're only new. When do we, there are certain risks that are maybe ones that aren't to do just with the commercial growth. And for me, it's always important to have those principles really outlined right from the beginning. Those seeds that get sown in the early days are going to grow. Now, this story I just told you was just one of many, many safety issues that were brushed under the carpet. There was this whole thing with female gamers and them getting a lot of abuse via Twitter. There was just an extreme amount of misogynistic behaviour that was going unchecked on the platform. Now, they did bring in somebody as a safety officer, so there was some thought of that in the early days. However, as she describes it, Del Harvey, She was really not integrated into the higher levels of the organization. So she talks about the safety aspect of things like playing whack-a-mole. So basically something would pop up and they would push it down. You know, if they decided it was bad enough, they would take that tweet down. And she really started to establish practices that could be really helpful. They developed tooling, but it was really, really clear as the company grew that those policies just continued to fail. And in particular, they were failing women. One of the arguments that was given for this is the so-called fail whale. Do you remember the fail whale? It was one of those things that when I was researching this, I was suddenly like, oh yeah, I think that kind of rings a bell. So Twitter had this fail whale. It's basically when the service went down, then you would get the fail whale pop up. And this would happen a lot. When demand spiked, the fail whale would appear. So the service would just go down. And this is really because they hadn't dealt with their technical debt. The underpinnings of the platform were not good enough to support what it was they were trying to do. So this is a battle that many founders are trying to fight, trying to grow the business commercially, and at the same time having to focus on making sure that technically that product will stand up. It's definitely something I've had with some of my businesses, where you need to make sure that the product is not going to let you down. Now, of course, we always talk about minimum viable product, but that viable product has to be delivering the benefits that the customer needs. Otherwise, you're not going to get growth, you're going to get churn. So the challenge for founders everywhere is trying to make sure that, yes, you are focusing on getting that technical quality built in. And I've certainly had times where I've had to say, no, we need to step back. We need to actually make sure we've really worked on this tech debt. We need to know where bugs are coming from. We need to be ready to sort out those technical problems. And we need to make sure that we've got the architecture and the technical infrastructure in order to make sure that the product can actually work when we get it into the hands of those important clients. Otherwise, it doesn't work and it's not even worth it. At the same time, this was used as the excuse for not doing the work on the safety side of things. And it's interesting because you'd think that that Twitter team would have been able to step back, take their creative skills and say, okay, we need the platform to do this, and we need to grow. And you do it with those creative limitations, just in the same way as 140 characters is a creative limitation. Sometimes those boundaries or those requirements can actually make it easier to build something, easier to get traction because you actually stand for something. And it's a shame that none of the founders were able to see that. Talking about the founders, I would suggest that this is one of the biggest controversies when it comes to Twitter, which is there was so much instability in that founding team. I mentioned the Noah Glass story earlier, so even though Noah Glass is often cited as a founder of Twitter, he was gone before it even started. And then only in 2008, Jack Dorsey was ousted by the board because he was seen as not the right person to be able to do the hypergrowth that was required by Twitter. Now, at this point, he had actually seen them through some fast growth between 2007 and 2008. In fact, that was a really pivotal time for them. But apparently the board didn't think it was enough. Now, a lot of this comes down to the idea that, as I've said before, people thought Jack was weird. Now, I don't know either way whether or not he was the right person at this point in time, but there was a sense that he was very conceptual and not everyone got it. He was pretty well respected by employees, but not everyone understood where he was coming from. There was one meeting when he came in and just started playing Blackbird by the Beatles, and the idea, I think, being that it was to do with a bird taking flight, Twitter growing. Now, I am not against playing music in a meeting. In fact, maybe people being receptive to that kind of energy would be exactly the kind of space you'd want to create in order to say, okay, how do we grow this business in a way that is ethical? I don't think they were even asking those questions at that point in time, but I'm all for different creative ways to help you think differently, because I think people get really trapped in specific ways of thinking, especially when you start really getting your eyes on that growth trajectory. But it sounds like Jack used to do this in a way that people weren't really ready for it. They didn't really understand it. Maybe it wasn't contextualized. He didn't tell anyone why he was playing Blackbird, or how the music might be able to help. So they all just kind of sat there and listened to it and then got on with the meeting. He was also known for leaving at 5, heading off, doing yoga, being outdoors. He had these boundaries, and while I would talk a lot about boundaries and being, giving yourself space, giving yourself care, I think that you also have to understand, as a CEO of a fast-growing business, that you do need to be around and you do need to be able to show up, and maybe you have to shift things slightly differently and get that fulfillment and those needs met in a way that also balances with what the business needs. Now, as an autistic person, when I hear a lot of these things about Jack Dorsey, I keep thinking, well, that sounds very neurodivergent to me. But I do think that the last video I did on hustle culture and whether that was needed for entrepreneurship, that maybe plays in a little bit to this conversation and what the expectation is for entrepreneurs, CEOs of high-tech, high-growth businesses. This was a long time ago, but I think there's still a sense here that he just wasn't around when he needed to be around, and you need to make yourself present. He also was himself around people who maybe didn't see that as the right thing, or who definitely didn't see that as the right thing for the business. And starting to understand the interplay between different people and what their needs are is also an important thing to do when you're a founder, especially if you've got a board and you need to figure out what they need. Now, they might not be the right board, and that's a whole other conversation. So even though Jack was fired as CEO, he was still on the board of Twitter, but apparently he refused to speak at board meetings for 2 years. And that in itself can be an issue, because as a board member, then you have liability for the company. If you refuse to speak, then you're not really doing your fiduciary duty to the company. So I would probably advise against that. He was not the only one to go. Evan Williams, who took over from Jack Dorsey, was also fired. And then Biz Stone was like, why are all my friends getting fired? And he decided to leave with Evan Williams as well. This was a little bit later on. The thing with Evan Williams is he'd kind of not realized that he had lost a lot of his shareholding, or enough of his shareholding that allowed him to then get kicked out. So he had gone from being the only shareholder, a major shareholder, to having few enough shares that the board was able to oust him in favor of Dick Costello. Twitter has also been blamed, or credited, however people look at it, for the first election of Trump. Probably the second one too, but in 2016, we were all still in social media bubbles. Now, I'd been very aware of the social media bubble. I think it was the 2010 election here in the UK when I first went, oh, just because those people who work with me think like this, and I'm kind of similar to my family and my friends, that doesn't mean that everyone thinks in the same way as me. So that became ever more apparent. And social media has really, well, it's both caused these bubbles, because we all get our own curated media now. But I do think it also has helped to make it apparent that we do think differently from a lot of other people. The night of Brexit, and that happened before Trump, I remember I was actually doing gymnastics training and I was thinking, yeah, I need to get home and go and vote. And I thought, do I even need to vote? Like, who's going to vote for Brexit? That's like the dumbest idea I've ever heard in my life. There's no way anyone's going to vote for it. And then I wake up the next morning and you're like, what the whole world changed. And I think the whole world did change in that moment, certainly for some sections of it. That really blew my mind. And then with the Trump presidency as well, it was just like, I know nothing. I do not understand people, and people do think differently from me. And I do think there's something important about understanding that people think differently from you and seeing different perspectives. What I don't think is good is this wild polarization that we now see, and people being put into boxes, and basically if you're in a different box, then all somebody's going to do is shout at you if you indicate that you might be at that different box, and you'll be dismissed immediately. And it is said that the Twitter founders have kind of grappled with that role they played with the 2016 election because they had aligned themselves differently politically. And what was it that Donald Trump had done that allowed him to really build a following? He understood how to use the platform to capture media attention. And he'd been doing this for years and years and years, just contentious little tweets that fired people up, you know? And it was always controversies, and he learned that from very early on. If you say something that's controversial, then everyone's going to listen, and it's really blooming annoying that is how people have to speak. I hate it. I wish we could come together more around things that were full of hope and creation and support and just making this world a better place. But anyway, when he got elected, Jack Dorsey said, "Having the president-elect on our service, using it as a direct line of communication, allows everyone to see what is on his mind in the moment. We're definitely entering a new world where everything is on the surface, and we can all see that in real time, and we can have conversations about it." He's right. I do think that there are things that can come up because we can have these conversations. It's not just that curated one media source, a couple of different media sources. We can, every single human has a platform if they want it now. It might still be a small platform in many cases, but they do have a platform. What I disagree with is this piece about things being on the surface. Yes, maybe you bring certain things to the fore, but the reality is it is on a surface level, and that's what's happened. Where is the depth? Where is the nuance? This is very extrovert territory when we start to talk about things being on the surface, real-time conversations. I don't like that. I would much rather have a conversation, or even be able to go away and think more deeply about something and then be able to put my point across. Maybe that's why I left Twitter and I haven't left YouTube, for example. So moving forward, there were other pivotal times with Twitter, and one was once COVID came along, it was very, very apparent that there was an issue with misinformation, partly because of the aforementioned president who didn't know what he was talking about, and again politicized even COVID and safety. But hey, well done, you re-elected him, that's great. That's going really well for all of us, isn't it? And that misinformation finally led to labeling on the Twitter platform. But what's interesting about this is it brings up a whole other conversation, and we don't have time for all of this today. Jack Dorsey really did not like this. Oh, I should have said, Jack Dorsey came back in as CEO in 2015. That revolving door kept revolving. So by the time we got to COVID, he was in that CEO role. So he didn't like removing content. He felt like, again, there was this underpinning principle around free speech and anybody should get to say anything. However, those policies did get signed through. But the whole conversation is about, well, who then becomes the arbiter of truth? Now, there's something about this showing the success of the platform, right? Because there are so many people on the platform, a lot of people using it as a news source, then if they take things down, they are seen to be arbiters of truth. And a lot of people are saying, well, who gets to decide what truth is? I think my argument is, number one, if you've built a platform, then actually it's your responsibility to decide what safety is, what hate is, what damage is to people. Does that make you the arbiter of truth? Well, if it's backed by science, if it's backed by research, then maybe, yeah. So that's all about getting the right policies in place. At the end of the day, the notion that any media, let alone a technology platform, which is being fed by millions of people, is completely objective or like truly represents any kind of truth is crazy. But I do see it as the responsibility of the people who create that platform to make sure that it is a safe place for people. And COVID is such an important example of when misinformation makes something dangerous, as is a lot of the political stuff. Now, back in 2020, and particularly because some of the things that were taken down were seen as more right-wing and some of the things that were kept up were seen as more left-wing, this was then seen as a real kind of left-wing platform, and therefore it was really attacked for that. But that wasn't the end of it. Of course, after COVID, a couple of other things happened, or during COVID. At the end of 2020, Trump lost the election, and then January the 6th, 2021, there were riots in the Capitol, and hashtag Kill Mike Pence was trending. Trump started tweeting and was spreading information and was riling up the crowds. And so he was actually banned from the platform. So we'd gone from this point where Jack Dorsey had talked about the president-elect being on Twitter and that being good because he could have this communication, to in 2021, when he was still president, getting taken off the platform for 12 hours. It was shown that he violated policies, and a couple of days later, he was banned for good. So we can all go and read all about him on Truth Social. Anyone here signed up for Truth Social? Maybe I should. I love the idea of being like a left-wing person on Truth Social. What happens to those people? I don't know. Do you know? Now, I personally do not think that somebody violating policies that have literally led to people being murdered. Let's not forget, January the 6th was an absolutely wild day. But even just looking on that Twitter piece, he violated the policies. Is that censorship to take somebody down? Is it left-wing to not want to spread hate? Does it make you a fascist? These are all the things that were thrown at Twitter and at Jack Dorsey. You could argue there's a form of censorship there, right? But you get to do that as somebody who runs a platform. The President of the United States has plenty of other platforms that they can go to if they want to get their voice heard. I don't think there's anything in the Constitution about Twitter having to be available to the President of the United States. Does it make you a fascist? I don't think they're the fascists in this. Let's fast forward 5 years and then we'll ask about where the fascists are. There's so much to learn from these controversies, and I think there's so many things that founders need to think about. The founders described it being, in the early days of Twitter, that they were hallucinogenically optimistic. That's incredibly scary. Hallucinogenically optimistic. I mean, what do we say in one of my colleagues says that you need to be optimistically vigilant. And I think that's a lot better than being hallucinogenically optimistic. Let's try and be optimistically vigilant as we build our companies. So yes, let's look at the positives. Let's look at this amazing vision, this future we can build. Let's look at the positives. But also you need to say, what are the potential things that are going to stop us from getting to that place? And not just about the growth, but about the impact it has on all stakeholders, all users. Biz Stone said that it was kind of like playing Jenga, building the business in the early days. You're like, no shit, that's what it is to build a business. That's what it is to be a founder. And your job is to make sure that you keep people safe while you're doing it. That is a part of your job as a founder. I honestly think the Twitter founders have even less of an excuse because they had that nice little soft beginning. It wasn't a soft landing, but they had that nice little soft beginning, right? They had advantages that a lot of founders don't even have in the beginning. So this idea that there was just a little bit too much going on in order for us to build something that was safe or to look after our users. You have to prioritize these things from the beginning. Twitter did not even launch Birdwatch, which was like its community moderation program, until 2021, and that's now called Community Notes in X. That was 15 years after it was founded. They had way too much money to make these kind of excuses. I'm sorry. They just did. I think the kill the whale story and the piece about having to make sure you go back and do that underlying architecture is an important lesson. It's a challenge to get those things right and to figure out exactly how to balance that. But you have to, I think, look a little bit further forward. You have to look at why you're doing each thing. Why are you interacting with a specific customer? If it's purely to get in this one bit of money right now, then okay, maybe do it. But if you actually want longevity, then you're going to need to focus on that technology if it's impeding the users from using it and getting the benefits from it. They say that when they fired the founders, they lost the vision and the fire. And that's one of the reasons that Jack ultimately came back in. But the whole things with the founders seems like such a mess. And to me, I look at it and go, they just did not have the leadership skills. It feels like they didn't have the right support around them. Like, it was such a mess. And they weren't really doing their jobs properly, based on all the things I've already said. I mean, what was this revolving door of CEOs? How many times did Jack come in and out of Twitter? It feels like he went through a lot, but they also talked about, even in the latter days, he just withdrew himself. He didn't have the resilience, and I get it. Like, I've been in that position where as a founder, I needed to withdraw. Again, as an autistically burnt out founder, I needed to withdraw. But you have to, I don't know, you have to try and find a way to give the company a graceful landing if that's what you're doing as well. Perhaps you would argue that that's what the Elon Musk deal was. And the final thing I want to say on this bit is that people like to pretend that our job of entrepreneurs is separate from philosophy, from politics, from society and social impact. But it's not. Our job is actually integral, and our job, it only has meaning, only has purpose if it does interact with all those things. And to build a successful business is to have some kind of impact. It's up to you to be choosing what kind of impact that is. It's also up to you to be choosing if you feel like there are times when there is a question between the bottom line and damage that might be done to others, that you have to be balancing that. And ultimately, if there's a time when you go, well, we can't afford to do that, so we're just going to have to leave things in a very unsafe way, that's poor leadership. And those people should not be running companies. There's no way of policing that, but that's just how I feel about it. But I also understand it, because I've been in those early stages of business when you're literally like, I can't pay my bills, I can't pay my team's bills if I don't make certain decisions. There's a lot to balance. It is like playing Jenga. Nobody said it was easy. No one ever said it would be this hard. So, after all of these things happened, Jack then probably made what was his biggest mistake, and he actually said that Elon Musk was the only person who could fix Twitter. Why? Has he been taking the same medicine as the Tesla board? Please can we stop this myth that individuals have some kind of wild superpower? Elon's money is powerful. His connections are powerful. Sure. That doesn't mean he is the only one who can fix Twitter. I guess you must have done a pretty bad job to that point if that's really the case. The myth of the individual with the superpower is a lie. So finally, on the 28th of October 2022, Elon Musk acquired Twitter for £38 billion or $44 billion. It took a while to get there because they ended up having to go to court, because one of the final controversies that I haven't mentioned is the fact that there were so many bots on Twitter. In fact, I think Musk referred to it as the botiverse or something along those lines, which is basically what he's trying to build anyway. So eventually he walked into the offices carrying a sink and said, "Let that sink in," on Twitter. He had got his hands on his very own free speech platform. So Musk immediately began to make changes. He fired the then CEO because Jack had stepped down previously. He fired the head of finance. He fired the head of legal policy. He laid off 80% of the staff. It's actually really crazy. Twitter only has 1,000 employees now. It's just tiny compared to other people like Meta. Of course, it's a different portfolio of products, but it just goes to show how little additional work is being done on Twitter. Trump was allowed back on the platform, as were Andrew Tate and Tommy Robinson. There's nothing that makes me more mad than these big followings for disgusting individuals. I've used the word disgusting a lot in this video. I'm sorry, I hope that's not bringing you down. Getting drunk off hate. If only we could regulate for that. Now, 61% of Twitter users are men. I'm sure that's increasing ever more by the day. On most social media platforms, it's approximately 50-50 gender balance. And very randomly, it's very big in Japan, but this has been all the way back to the Twitter days. And it turns out that Twitter was actually really well placed for Japan due to cultural, linguistic, and usability reasons. Because the Japanese language uses characters rather than letters, they can actually say a lot more in 140 characters. But it also aligns really nicely with succinct Japanese poetry, like the haiku. Japanese users also prefer the anonymity of Twitter over something like Facebook. For cultural reasons, because it's anonymous, it gives them a lot more freedom to be able to express feelings and opinions freely. Also, there are a lot of fandoms, like the anime fandom in Japan, which Twitter really does help you to connect with. And because it's so easy to use and it's particularly good in high density urban areas, it also works really well in Japan. So that's where we are now. I'm not going to talk much more about the current state of X or x.ai, only to say that one thing that has given me some hope is that the fact it's gone so rogue with these illegal images, the fact that Elon Musk initially was not interested in dealing with it, although actually has gone back on that a little bit now, has allowed us to see that our governments are starting to hold the tech bros to account. Now, there's still so much more that could potentially be done, but we have online safety bills. I know some of the people who worked really hard to get them through and who are working even harder to ensure that the internet continues to stays even safer for people. But this does give me hope. I feel like it gives me direction and purpose too. So let's summarize. Is X Marmite? No. To say it was would trivialize the hate-driven cesspool that it is. And I hate to say it, but I feel like Twitter was always set up to fail us at least, even if it may be seen as a startup success. Even though some people have become billionaires off the back of it. Evan Williams once said, "All successful founders will make some enemies along the way." Now, I do believe that's true. But I think that you can at least try not to. And I'm purposefully not going to listen to him as I step into my future. I don't think you need to make enemies in order to be successful. And I think you can at least be thinking, how can I, if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all. I guess as a founder, there is a case of like having to do things that other people might not like. But I do think that there's ways to do that are compassionate. The other thing, Twitter wasn't built on strong foundations. It was crumbling from the start. If you're building a business, I really do encourage you to ask yourself from the beginning, what are the non-negotiables? But also, what are the risks from what we're doing? And how can we mitigate against them? What do you stand for? What principles matter to you? Now, you could argue that, especially with Jack, is something that was consistent throughout, although lots of other things weren't so consistent, in terms of the ideas around free speech being about anyone being allowed to post anything whenever they wanted to. But I encourage you also to think through some of those principles that you have. Do they show compassion? Do they show care? And hold on to those with dear life. Now, if your principle is become a billionaire without any care as to what that does to anybody else, then you probably haven't made it to the end of this video anyway. I also want to remind you something which I know Elon Musk definitely disagrees with. Regulation is not a bad thing. And Jack Dorsey once said, it can protect individuals and level the playing field. If you are a tech founder, get yourself in the conversations about what regulation needs to look like. We are still in the land of the Wild west in terms of digital tech and AI. And if you have made it all the way to the end, I encourage you, in the words of Jack Dorsey, to pick your revolution and join it. Let me know what you stand for in the comments. If you've made it this far, please make sure you're subscribing. That really will help me and the growth of this channel. I hope to see you soon, and have a good one. Bye.